So today I am with Rune Christensen, who is the founder of MakerDAO and the price stable DAI token, that's DAI. Now, with all the uncertainties surrounding the stability of projects like Tether, but at the same time with tons of people using it, I personally thought it was time to introduce some alternatives into the conversation. So I reached out to Rune, which is rare because normally guests come to us, and he was kind enough to join us for a chat today. So Rune, welcome to the Cryptoverse.
Thanks for having me.
So I heard of MakerDAO a while ago, and to my understanding, the DAI thing is a more recent innovation. Is that true?
Yeah, so I mean, MakerDAO has actually existed for 3 years at this point,
Right.
and the entire time we've been working towards creating DAI. It's just,
Okay.
it's very it's been a very long road, and there's been a lot of inventions and design iterations required.
Okay.
But then this December 17, we finally launched the first version of DAI onto the Ethereum mainnet, and it's now live on exchanges and decentralized exchanges and used in a few dApps.
Okay, so explain, if for people who have never heard of the MakerDAO project before, can you give us an overview of that? Like, what's with the name as well? Because to me, when I see Maker, that reminds me of like the DIY manufacturing movement.
Yeah, which is actually funny because we didn't like. I think it resonates very well with what MakerDAO is about, but we didn't actually really keep that in mind. So Maker, the name comes from market maker, because Maker is like this organization that's behind the DAI stablecoin, and it basically is the entity that guarantees the liquidity and the stability of the currency, and sort of protects it in the market and maintains it so that it's stable and useful as a currency for business.
Okay, but so it's market maker DAO, like decentralized autonomous organization.
Yes, you could say that. However, it's a lot more than market making. In fact, like the market making aspect is not really the primary aspect, and it's more like it's sort of the organization that just allows the DAI to exist.
Okay.
And then we just think it's a powerful name, and then it also resonates with like do-it-yourself hardware movements and just a lot of other things, right? And it's really it's like we see it really as it's like a new paradigm in finance that can build this entirely new, just a more sound and robust and transparent financial infrastructure from the ground up. So in that sense, I also think it's a fitting name.
Right. So what was, when you founded the MakerDAO project, what was the inspiration for it? What was like the problem you wanted to solve with it?
So yeah, I mean that's a long story because so I initially got into Bitcoin in 2011, and I pretty much immediately got the whole picture right and got super excited about it. And I invested most of the profits from my first business into just purchasing a lot of Bitcoin right around the time of the Mt. Gox crash and that big bubble back in the early days. So I sort of saw my money multiply massively and then lose a ton of its value. And so that experience made it pretty clear to me that crypto, that like as long as that is one of the primary things you have to deal with when you're trying to do something with cryptocurrency, that's really going to hold it back, right? Because I mean that kind of volatility is just not something that average people really would like to deal with.
On the way up,
and then,
I like it, but not on the way down.
Yeah, I mean it's great when it's going up, but then in economic theory, there's this concept of loss aversion that like it's worse when you lose money, like it's worse when you lose something than when you gain it to some degree, right? So like a crash can be felt a lot worse than a bubble.
Oh
like
yeah, I think that's an established psychological principle, is that human beings will do more to avoid loss than they will to achieve a gain. In fact, Tony Robbins talks about this. So even when he's talking about if you want to achieve your goals, think about going from 30K a year salary to 60K, but then think about going from 30K to 15K. Like if you dropped your salary from 30K to 15K, the amount of energy and motivation that will come out of you to get back to 30K is on an order of magnitude higher than it would be to double your salary from 30 to 60.
Yeah, and that's a really good argument against volatility in the marketplace, right? Because that means that even if the price on average is stable or something, right? But it just keeps keeping these ups and downs. Overall, that's a really just not a very conducive environment for doing business or just being like a regular person, saving up your money or something like that.
Right, exactly.
So I mean, it very early on it became apparent to me that first of all, there's this insane, crazy potential in the blockchain space, right? Like it's a new internet, or even bigger than that, right? I mean, it's just like a total revolution. But at the same time, nothing is really happening with that true potential yet, right? I mean, it's primarily this wishy-washy ICOs and libertarian or anarchism stuff, and the actual impact on the business world isn't really that great at the moment. And that's because there isn't this stable medium of exchange. There hasn't really been this, just like this crypto, like this currency you can use under the hood for all these different decentralized applications and use cases that will become available through blockchain technology in the future. And then I actually got into BitShares very early on in that project. And BitShares actually was the first ever stablecoin project. So. Yes. They invented the concept of the stablecoin, and they made a functional stablecoin very early on called BitUSD that still exists to this day and has been stable around US dollar for 4 years at this point. And BitShares also had a number of other innovations that ultimately have been leveraged in the design of Maker, which includes like this community spirit of like using the community to control the project and like govern it and decide its direction, instead of necessarily having this like centralized management or like particular leaders being in charge of things. So I was into BitShares for about half a year, and then at some point there was just some things not really going so well with the momentum of the project early on. And one of the main problem, as I saw it, was this lack of liquidity in BitUSD, this early BitShares stablecoin. There was simply no, so there was this other competitor at the time called Nubits, which is also another really early stablecoin that came out a little bit later.
Yep.
Yeah, and they had really, really strong sort of market making from the project itself, whereas in BitShares, all of this, like the BitShares sort of just relied on the market to just come up with the liquidity on its own out of thin air, so to speak.
Was there not sufficient incentives there?
Well, the fundamental incentives that keeps the BitUSD stable was there, but it's like, the liquidity is this thing that like it's hard to bootstrap liquidity in the first place, and you need to sort of give it a big push, and then once you've got it, then it just builds upon itself easily.
Sure.
And so then combined with a number of other issues in the BitShares community, or not necessarily issues, but just like different factors, and then the emergence of Ethereum made it clear to me that there was a huge opportunity to build a really, really sound stablecoin on Ethereum. So I just took that upon myself, basically, that I wanted to build that what I called at the time and still consider the ultimate stablecoin, right? Like, so a stablecoin that's just designed from the bottom up to really solve all the problems that hadn't been solved in the stablecoin space until that time. And that includes then this whole concept of market making and like strong focus on bootstrapping the liquidity, with MakerDAO being a driver of liquidity. And then also there have been a few other key innovations on top of the original BitUSD model. The most important of them is just the idea of using diversified collateral. So where in BitUSD you only use BitShares as a collateral, which is like the basic concept, right? Is that for a stablecoin you have a stablecoin that's $1, and then you put, let's say, $3 worth of collateral behind it. And that's the fundamental idea of BitUSD originally, and which then it has been translated over to DAI. But the difference is in DAI, this collateral can be all sorts of stuff. It can be, it can be ETH, obviously, and that's what we're using right now in the system that's live right now. But then, the current live system is still just a beta meant for integration tests and various like final adjustments to prepare for the big launch of our fully scalable solution, which is coming this summer, that we refer to as the multi-collateral system, multi-collateral DAI, because that's where we add in this crucial feature of allowing any type of collateral to be used.
So are there some like common design principles, taking away the specific technology of, say, the BitShares network or the Ethereum network? Are there some economic principles that are common when you're trying to build a price stable asset, whether that's in the crypto space or in the traditional financial world?
Yeah. So I guess the most important principle that is required for a stablecoin to sort of be allowed to call itself a stablecoin is that it needs to be designed around the black swan event scenario. So like a stablecoin design and any sort of thinking you do when you try to come up with a stablecoin design has to revolve around trying to solve what happens when the whole market crashes, right? When all assets are crashing at the same time and everything is just, everybody's trying to get out of everything, and it's like the financial crisis, but even worse.
Okay, let's get to that. I think we need to set up before that, because that's something that comes a bit later. So before we go there, so let's set up like the mechanism itself. So if the DAI or the BitUSD or whatever is designed to remain stable at $1's worth, a dollar value, we know how Tether does that, because it's supposedly a 1-to-1 ratio between a US dollar in the corporation's bank account for every single Tether token in existence. So that doesn't have an algorithmic mechanism or a market making system to remain stable. It's just everyone believes that a Tether is backed by a dollar in a bank that you could withdraw. So the question is, when the DAI token, for example, suddenly becomes worth like $1.01, how does it then swing back to $1? And then what happens if it goes to 99 cents? What happens to swing it back to $1 in the opposite direction? So can you explain that mechanism?
Yeah, so I guess so first of all, the key is this principle that there is additional collateral behind it, right? So for $1 worth of DAI, right now, if you go and check it in the smart contracts on Ethereum, there's about $3 worth of ETH backing it. And then for this,
whose is that ETH?
Yeah, so that is the ETH of belonging to the people who generated the DAI in the first place. And this is like
it comes into existence.
Yeah, and it's actually an interesting mechanism, because it comes into existence through people who actually don't want stability, but rather want leverage. So to some degree, it's like a stability marketplace, you could say, where on one hand you got these people who want stability, who want to buy the stablecoin and hold something that's worth $1, and then on the other hand you got these people who actually who already have ETH, and they want to sort of access additional liquidity out of this ETH. So what they do is they deposit their ETH into our system, and the system then is like sort of looks at how much ETH is there and how much DAI can we safely generate out of this ETH to ensure that the system remains safely over collateralized. And they're then able to just directly generate this DAI out of the system and get it into the wallet, and then go to the market and spend it. And then the market price of DAI obviously is affected by market forces, and there's going to be people who just like times where everybody wants to just get into DAI and everybody's buying it, so suddenly the price goes a little bit above $1, or on the other hand, some people want to get out of it and want to get into other assets, something, and it can go below.
Okay. Let's just rewind again. So let's put some actual numbers on it just to play out the actual scenario. So if one ether was worth, say, $1,000, just for argument's sake, right? And then you said that at least, so what percentage collateral has to be behind a DAI? Because I remember with when BitUSD was created, it was something like 200% or something.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't care about how much collateral has to be behind the DAI when it's created. What we care about is like, what's the absolute minimum amount of collateral that has to back a DAI before our system has to liquidate it.
So it has to be a minimum of 100% then.
For us, it's 150%. Like that ratio always has to be more. Like it always has to be some excess level, right? Because you have to make sure that there's enough time to actually liquidate the position, even during like a bear market where the price is dropping quickly, or something like that.
Okay.
So that's sitting at 150% right now. Yeah, I mean, I have a dashboard open right here, and the overall collateralization of the system right now is 360%. So that's sort of on average how much an average person is over collateralizing their individual position of the people who are generating DAI, right? So those who actually are leverage seekers.
Mm-hmm. So those are the people that are. So you get to decide that then. Me, if I had 1,000 Ether on deposit, and I wanted to create a number of DAI, if it was backed by 300%, 1,000 Ether, sorry, one Ether at $1,000 could create like 333 DAI tokens, each backed with 300% collateral.
Yes, exactly. And you're there's full flexibility in the system. So someone who wants to create a leverage position like this, they can decide if they want 2x leverage or 1.5x. But the only thing they can't do is they can't go above 3x, right? They can't go, they can't end up with a position that has less than 150% over collateralization. Because if they do that, then the system immediately automatically sells off their position for them in order to recapitalize the system.
Okay, this is the bit I don't get. If I have my one Ether worth $1,000, why would I turn it into 333 DAI tokens with 300% collateral? Why? What's my incentive to do that?
So this is a really common question, right? That people usually, this is one of the first things that people they sort of ask about it. But then so let me just rewind a little bit to earlier, right? So this is a system with two sides to it. On the one hand, there are people who want stability, right? So they have let's say Bitcoin or dollars or something, and they want to buy a stable cryptocurrency.
Yes.
So they go and buy DAI at $1 each and just hold that DAI and use it and for trade or whatever, and they never worry about this other part of the system that has to do with the generation of DAI and having these over collateralized positions.
Right.
So the people who go and use the over collateralized positions, which by the way are called CDP, so collateralized debt positions, which is like a smart contract in the system. So the people who use collateralized debt positions are they are volatility seekers or leverage seekers. So what they want is let's say if they're using ETH, right? What they're interested in is getting additional exposure to ETH. So let's say they put in one ETH, generate $300 worth of DAI. Then they will be able to take that additional money they generated with the DAI and, for instance, purchase more ETH with it. And that's how they get their leverage. So in that scenario, you end up with it's a relatively low leverage ratio if you put in $1,000 worth of ETH and generate $300 worth of DAI. You basically get something like 1.3x or something around
key.
that.
That's absolutely key. So, okay, you did answer my question. I was just creating a little bridge in my mind there. So I started off with my one Ether worth $1,000, right? And then I generate my 300 DAI tokens, which are worth 300. But then I go and use those DAI to buy an extra, say, $300 worth of Ether. So I now have my original 1,000 plus the 300, but my original 1,000 is now at risk, if you like, because that's what I'm taking on the risk to create the stability, right? So I'm saying I'll put my $1,000 Ether at risk in order to create these DAI tokens, and then I spend them right into the market and end up with more Ether, so that if that Ether goes up in value, like you say, I get 1.3 times leverage versus 1.0 if I just held onto my Ether without creating DAI tokens.
Yeah, exactly. And we also have a lot of user stories about what people have been using this feature for. For instance, there's someone who I guess at this point it's a little unfortunate, right? But he believed that the price of ETH would continue to go up at around when the price was, let's say, around 1,000 or something. So at that point in time, he wanted to buy a new car, but he also didn't want to lose his ETH exposure.
Mm-hmm.
So what he did was he just borrowed enough money with his Ethereum as collateral to go and like cash out the DAI for dollars,
mm-hmm.
which you can do. There's one exchange right now where you can actually trade DAI directly for dollars,
Okay.
and then get it to your bank account. And then he went and bought a car. So he actually, like, he financed a car from a blockchain, you could say.
Right.
And another person just refinanced his mortgage. So basically, he borrowed enough money from Maker with his Ethereum as collateral to then go to his bank and repay his loan, because he saw that the interest rate that Maker is charging right now is just a bit lower than what his bank was charging him. And then, of course, in both of these cases, right, there's like a really important like lesson to be learned, which is playing with leverage is super risky, right? Yeah. And I think both of those people now probably regret doing that at assuming they did it at the high, like at the top, of like 1,300 or whatever Ethereum went to. Yeah. I'm not sure if they did that actually. It could easily be that they did it earlier.
I take your point though. So to be one of these, I'm in my mind, I'm creating like a retail market, which is the retailers that just don't really care how the mechanics work. They just want the price stable asset, so that if the market volatility is too much for them, they can just sell all their altcoins into DAI and then just sit there in a price stable asset until they're ready to come back in again, in exactly the same way that people use Tether, right? So I would call that in my mind, that's like the retail market. But then underground, absolutely, there's like a wholesale market. But to participate here, you really need to know what you're doing. You need to understand market dynamics, trading, like almost like derivatives, leverage, and all this, and actually know what you're doing in terms of, I suppose, technical analysis, so you can see where you can look at the probability of where the price is going to go, because you don't want to, it's kind of like, so you might get margin called, right? So if I do that thing where I turn my $1,000 worth of Ether into $1,300, if the price of Ether rises, then I'm controlling 1.3 Ether by really only owning 1 Ether, right? So that's fine to the upside. And actually, it then means that the DAI that I created becomes more collateralized, doesn't it? Right. So because I only owe, if you like, I only owe $300 worth of DAI, right? But then if it goes the opposite direction, and that 1 Ether becomes worth $500, say, now there's only $500 of Ether backing that $300 worth of DAI. And like you say, if it gets below 150% backing, then what happens?
Yeah, so I mean, so if it went to 500, then you would actually, you'd still be slightly above it, right? But you'd be really close.
$450 is 150% of 300 in it. So as long as your Ether is still worth $450, given that we've got $300 worth of DAI, that's fine until it goes to like $449. Now it's too little. So what happens?
Yeah. So what happens is that the system just immediately liquidates you. So I mean, we liken it to a margin call, but the difference is that typically with margin calls you have some time to actually react.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the case with Maker, or at least the raw system, sort of the raw smart contracts infrastructure underneath, right? It just, the moment that your collateralized deposition is below what's called a liquidation ratio,
mm-hmm,
it is immediately liquidated autonomously by the system. So the system itself.
Does that mean it takes your Ethereum off you and then puts it into and buys back the DAI that you owe automatically?
Yes,
and then destroys it.
So what it does is it takes all of your collateral and it sort of makes a note of your debt,
mm-hmm,
and then it starts an auction where it basically tries to sell off your collateral to earn back the debt.
Right. In my case, it's $300, right?
Yeah, so so actually what it would go out and would say, who wants to pay $300 for $450 worth of ETH or something like that.
Okay.
And everybody will obviously want, like, that's a really great deal, right? So people will start to bid on that, and then what the system will try to do is see what's sort of the minimum amount of ETH I have to sell in order to recapitalize the shortfall that right now exists in the system.
Okay.
And ultimately, it should end up, end up selling somewhere around $300 worth of ETH to recapitalize the 300 DAI debt.
Right. It's via a mini auction, though, right?
Yeah, via an auction that happens autonomously in the system.
Okay.
And so right now, it's actually a bit simplified, the system that we're using in the beta. But it's just available for anyone to participate in these auctions, or in these this autonomous liquidation from the our dashboard, which is like the advanced user page that you use when you want to play with collateralized depositions. And in the future, there will just be like this nice user interface available to participate in the auctions. But actually, what's even more crucial in the long run is that this entire sort of type of interaction, where you're interacting directly with the core system smart contracts for some advanced behavior. Primarily, we expect it to be bots, right, and like institutional traders running some sort of algorithm who participate in these things. And we're spending a lot of energy on finding the right institutional partners, and like various like hedge funds and VCs, and just like all these entities that are getting into the crypto space now and have the necessary capital and the necessary know-how to be able to efficiently participate in this process.
Sure. Because that's why I was talking about the principles, because the idea of a price stable asset, well, these exist in the derivatives market anyway, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, they're I mean, the best comparison is actually just currency, right? Like,
True.
Currency is like this type of price stable asset that is sort of backed by a larger portfolio, right? So like the bank has, they have on their balance sheet, they have their liabilities, which is a whole bunch of deposits, and then they have their assets, and then that's like a much larger pile of assets, basically, right? That ensures that they can back all these outstanding deposits they have.
That's a good point. So that if you had a bank run and people wanted to withdraw the currency, they could either use their current assets, their actual cash, or they could sell stuff off their balance sheet for cash and then be able to, distribute the cash to their customers, right? So I hadn't actually thought about it like that before. I just wanted to finish off that example though. So at the point where I get my autonomous liquidation, right, because my Ether is now, worth $449, and it's it's below the 150% ratio. So the smart contract automatically liquidates me. Does the auction manage to get at least $300 worth of Ether for my DAI tokens? And then those 300 DAI that I created originally, say, do they then get pulled from do they vanish out of the supply?
Well, so what happens is that the auction manages to buy up 300 DAI from somewhere, right, basically, right? Like, but what's really crucial about the system is that it doesn't have to be your original DAI, so to speak, right? And in fact, there is no such thing. Like, the moment that you have generated, let's say, 300 DAI out of the system, the DAI you've generated now have no special connection to your particular collateralized deposition. They instead have a claim, sort of to the generalized portfolio, really.
I see, because that debt's been transferred to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, initially they actually just go into your wallet, but then you can immediately start using them anywhere and send them to anyone.
I know what you mean. So I end up with the 300 DAI, so they don't get destroyed. It's just that I now have 300 DAI instead of my $450 worth of Ethereum. The key distinction I was trying to make there, though, is that 300 DAI that I now have, that's being backed by someone else's Ethereum.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, or rather, you could say it's backed a little bit from everyone's.
Right. I see. Yeah. Sorry, I was doing that for simplification. It's not one person, right? It's a whole market. I see what you mean.
But then, so there's one crucial point to then make here, and that is, well, so like I said earlier, right? There's going to be all these different types of collateral in the system. So right now we got Ethereum, but we recently went out and said that we are planning to use Digix Gold large scale as a collateral type as well, because it's like a really nice it has like a nice, clear regulatory framework for how they're doing the tokens. And then crucially, it's gold, right? So it's not correlated to crypto in the same
gold, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not correlated like the way Ethereum and Bitcoin are correlated to each other, right? So like, even though it's nice that we will also have Bitcoin in the portfolio this summer, and we'll also have like Litecoin, and we'll also have Augur, Reputation, and all the other big Ethereum tokens. But generally, I mean, if you go to CoinMarketCap and have a look right now, right, it's pretty obvious that all of these assets are pretty much 100% correlated or very close, right? Like, so it doesn't really help much if you diversify across many different cryptocurrencies.
That's a very good point, mate. That is a very good point.
So you don't. Yeah, I mean, so it's really crucial that you get some uncorrelated stuff, like
some non-crypto, ideally, because otherwise you may as well just back it all with Ether.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect this extreme correlation that we are seeing in these early days to persist, like in the long run, right, in crypto space. But it's just always going to be like a lot of correlation for sure. And that's where gold is like really nice, because that means you can have, so when you have like one DAI stablecoin, then you can be like, okay, so this is backed in excess by a bunch of Ethereum, and that's really great. But if the Ethereum crashes like crazy, it's actually fine because it's also backed by gold, for instance, and the gold will sort of, like make up partially for what will happen in the crypto space. I mean, of course, that's oversimplification. Like, it's not enough if you just got crypto and gold, right? You also got to have all these other things. Like, you got to have, securities is actually really the big goal. That we're spending a lot of energy right now on figuring out how to make our system work with security tokens, and we're working with projects in something like 4 or 5 really good jurisdictions, and we expect that at least one of them should come through around the time of our launch, or like in 2018, and that will really allow us to start to have this like really solid base of stability to build the system upon that will be resistant to something like a crazy overnight crypto crash or something like that.
Right. So here's a question: How does the DAI smart contract know what the price of Ether is?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and like really crucial point. So I mean, so the answer to that is it's an oracle, right? And you probably heard that. Yeah. I mean, you're probably familiar with that concept, right? And oracles are really, the best way to describe it is that they are like the Achilles heel of smart contracts or something like that, right? Like, they're like the weak point of smart contracts, and they're the thing that that takes smart contracts from like 100% autonomous to really just like a more efficient version of what we currently got, but not necessarily like super futuristic or like AI or something like that, right? But so anyway, so oracles have to be designed in a really, really like robust way that are focused on protecting against attacks and like mitigating the impact of attacks. And luckily, we've actually been able to come up with a design that I believe is, it is just like strong enough that you don't actually have to worry about the risk of the oracles being attacked, somehow like causing you to lose your money or something like that. Because I think actually, if like any system or any smart contract that leaves the door open for someone to take over the oracles, and then use that to steal all the money from all the users, that's just like unacceptable. I mean, no one should ever use a system like that because it's just too much risk. What we do is that we have this basically a delay. So like we don't immediately accept the data that's being pushed from our decentralized oracle. So we have like a decentralized oracle, first of all, that it has like a whole bunch of nodes, and then we basically assume that they are all compromised at all times, right? And so we scrutinize the data that they're sending in heavily, and then impose a delay on the data so that it first sort of have to be primed in the system. So they have to say, we are going to report that the price of ETH is $1,000 an hour from now, right? So there's this like 1 hour delay where the core system doesn't sort of accept the new value yet until the delay has passed. And then during that delay, a different component of a system then has the possibility to just like shut down everything, essentially. Like basically say, okay, we are under attack. It's time to like stop, like cease all operations and do like a graceful unwinding of the system, basically. And this is what we call global settlement, which is in many ways, that's like one of the key features of the system, because what global settlement does is it guarantees that the DAI you have in your wallet has, the DAI you have in a wallet, let's say you have 1,000 DAI or something, when MakerDAO goes out and says one DAI is $1, what that actually means is that the target price as defined in the system, so that's like a variable in the system, is set to $1. And that's actually not enforced. Like, it's not like the system buys and sells DAI all the time in the market or something to maintain it at $1. But what the system does guarantee is that if global settlement happens, either in the event of an attack or in the event of, for some other reason, like maybe because of like severe market irrationality or just like a giant crash or something, then global settlement is triggered, and then you get exactly the target price of your DAI sort of paid to your wallet and settled in the collateral that's held in the collateral portfolio.
Yes.
So actually DAI sort of, when global settlement happens, what happens is that your DAI basically becomes like a basket of all these various assets.
Yep.
And in the long run, that could be thousands of assets. So it could be that like if you got one DAI in your wallet, now you got like 0.1 cent of gold and 0.1 cent of Bitcoin and 0.1 cent of German government bonds and like all these various things. And then the important thing is that the system sort of ensures that with its its programming into the smart contracts that this all adds up to one.
Yep. So you've you've effectively then cracked open your DAI, and inside is all these little pieces of value. Yeah, and it's actually very similar to what happens to an ETF when it goes bust, basically. Like, so if you have an ETF that's like backed by real assets, kind of, and it doesn't perform well enough, and it's not able to sustain itself, then what happens is people can sort of go to the exchange with their ETF shares and basically say, I want the underlying stuff, and then they sort of divide up all the underlying assets. And just end up with this basket of assets that were originally supposed to be in the ETF in the first place. Gotcha. Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about, which, like, yes, we explained like the price stability mechanism and how it remains stable at $1 plus or minus like a fraction of a percent or whatnot. But I was going to say, okay, like realistically, like what externality would have to happen to actually cause sufficient chaos within the price stability mechanism as to actually break it. But with that global settlement thing, that's actually the insurance against like a major variation in, I don't know, price feeds or God knows what external factors that could risk the integrity of the system. Even in that situation, like you say, there's a graceful winding down of the situation where you end up with the same amount of value. Granted, at that point, you're left with all of the assets that are no longer price stable, but at the point where it winds down, you have the same amount of wealth you had 5 minutes ago. Yeah, exactly. And the important thing is this also means that that's the best you can achieve if you attack the system, right? So it removes the incentive for someone to go in and start manipulating the price feeds in order to somehow like make money from it. Right. Because they want to actually be able to impact sort of the fundamental value of and who sort of has claims to what of the collateral portfolio in the system. Right. That's because bringing down the DAI system, there's not much profit in that per se. What you really want to do is game the leverage system so you can siphon off some value, right? Yeah. I mean, now you're talking about if you had access to manipulating the price feeds. Right. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and theoretically, yes, but basically that's where the delay and the global settlement together just completely makes that like unviable. Right. And of course, we can't actually promise that it will never happen, because who knows if someone wants to do it just for spite or something, right? Or a competitor or something like that. So we still have to be, I mean, we're still insanely careful with setting up a super robust decentralized oracle. And we are making sure like it's going to be more, like, there's going to be way more resources and sort of know-how thrown at this decentralized oracle
for the particular use case of giving these continuous price feeds than you know than most other projects who are even specializing in providing oracles, because our oracles are made specifically with like this extreme robustness in mind, right? Where it's just all about making them resistant to attacks.
Right. That's all you can really do, is make them as resilient as possible, right?
Yeah, and actually also what we want to do is actually diversify the oracles themselves. So like actually we also want to include eventually the best of the other oracle projects on Ethereum. Mm-hmm. So we have been in talks with a lot of them, and like been looking at all these various different projects, and we haven't really made any decisions yet. But in the future we could do something like, say like have like, let's say 100 nodes from our own Oracle infrastructure, right? And then have like, let's say 20 nodes from some other Oracle, Oracleize is an example of an Oracle project. And there's like Chainlink, and there's a whole bunch of others that all are doing a lot of cool innovation in the space. And in the long run, we can just leverage all of those that we think are good. And then basically what we do is we sort of collate all of the price feeds that they're sending out into a single contract that we call the medianizer, where we then sort of weigh them all and then just take the weighted median of all of these various Oracle price feed sources. And that weighted median is then the data feed that feeds into our Oracle security module, which is then sort of the module that provides the last resort defense, right? And sort of like delays the data, analyzes it, and if we detect that it's an attack, that there's just something completely off with the value, right, then the system is shut down before the value is actually fed into the system and has any effect on the internal parameters of the system.
Right. But in order to prevent that, the more decentralized this Oracle gets, and the greater number of data feeds are coming in, well, the less and less likely it is to fail, because if you were an attacker, you would have to effectively figure out where all those oracles were and take control of them all somehow, right? You know what I mean? To sufficiently game the system.
Yeah, and I mean, our goal is just to reach a point where it's just not realistic.
It's just impossible,
at all, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And because of course it is. I mean, so on one hand, you can say global settlement is really good because it protects your wealth, and it sort of takes off the fear that, oh no, I'm relying on the system, and then one day actually if it fails, my money could be gone. Mm-hmm. And we sort of, you don't have to worry about that. But I mean, even if you have to, having global settlement happen to you is still really annoying, because it means you lose access to a stability service, right, or the leverage service. Right. So I mean, that's still a really, really annoying user experience. And obviously, we're doing everything we possibly can to make sure that it never happens. And we actually, we had an alpha running before the current single collateral DAI system. Mm-hmm. We actually had that running for 6 months, and then we since last summer. So actually the system has been live and working for quite a long time at this point, and remained stable around $1. But then, so when we upgraded from this alpha version to the current beta version, we did that through a global settlement of the alpha, right? So the alpha. Okay. So actually we launched the beta, and then we enabled people to do a one-to-one, conversion of their alpha stablecoins into the beta stablecoins. Mm-hmm. And then after enough people had done that, and sort of the momentum for migrating over went down, then we did a global settlement of the old system, and then everybody just moved over to the new system, right?
Okay.
And that's going to be the same process that we will do this summer when we upgrade to the final multi-collateral system. Mm-hmm. So people will have to go through a global settlement still one more time, which is one of the main reasons why we're like very, we're not really pushing the system in a consumer sense, right? We're not really trying to get everyone to adopt it for their sort of vital business needs just yet. But what we are doing is we're trying really hard to make everyone start testing the system, right? Mm-hmm. In like integration tests and figuring out how can they start using all the possibilities that become available once we launch the full version this summer.
Gotcha.
And then the goal is, once the system is running this summer, it will never ever be globally settled again, never be taken down. There'll never be any disruption, right? Like, it's actually going to be like a full launch where it's like it's ready for business, and it's scalable to just like yeah, I mean basically any size. The only thing that could possibly make us like the only thing that could possibly come in the way of us scaling to basically trillions of dollars is if we don't have access to enough high quality collateral in the short run.
Mm-hmm.
So like I was saying earlier, that's what we're really focusing a lot right now, right? We're like trying really hard to line up stuff like security tokens and just all these like interesting uncorrelated assets like real estate, and just like securities, commodities, even currency. Actually, we even plan to use like actual fiat currency as collateral in the system as well.
Okay. That sounds good. One thing I just wanted to define for any listener that doesn't know. So the definition of an oracle, in my mind, is where like a blockchain needs to communicate with the real world or some data feed that's outside of its reach almost. So it's like a piece of middleware almost that takes data from one place and then feeds it into the blockchain. Is that an accurate definition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really accurate. And I think the name oracle comes from this notion that the price feed is trusted, right? Like it's just like some external account that's like sending in some numbers, and the smart contracts is just like, okay, this number is definitely the Ethereum price,
right? Because
they have no way of really knowing what's going on, right? So they just have to trust the oracles, which is why they have that funny name, right? Because they are this. There's something where you just assume, well, this part, I'm just assuming that this part works as it's supposed to.
If you're going to consult an oracle, then you assume it's going to be an authority.
Yeah, exactly. And then and actually, as our system shows, is the only thing you can do if the oracle starts sending you garbage data is shut down. Like you can't really, it is really the weakest point, right? Because you just can't sort of operate under an environment where the oracles actually start sending you the wrong information, right? Like the only thing you can do is you can try to figure out, okay, when was the last time they gave me some correct data, right? I can trust. And then I'm going to basically settle everything based on the last correct data I had.
Right. Sure. Okay,
so there's actually one thing I would like to talk a little bit about, just like in the context of the system. And I think we ended up doing the whole complicated going through everything. So I just want to round off one last part of the system.
Okay, go for it.
So we have these collateralized depositions, right? We have that are over collateralized and that are backing the DAI, and they're, for instance, holding Ethereum and gold and bonds, whatever. And the crucial thing is that even when you generate some DAI that's backed by Ethereum, or you generate some DAI that's backed by gold, they actually are fungible with each other. So they don't the moment they're created, they no longer sort of belong to that particular, like, you can't say, oh, this DAI here is backed by ETH, or like, this one here.
Not in the way that I was talking. When I say, right, my Ether was backing those DAI, it doesn't really work like that.
Yeah, but the crucial thing is, like, I mean, if that's all there is to it, then people they should be really skeptical about this, right? Because it's not like you can say, well, I mean, an asset that's backed by Ethereum is as stable as one that's backed by gold, because that doesn't really make sense, right? There should be different risk profiles to them, and thus making them non-fungible. But that's where this final piece of the puzzle, or the final piece basically comes in, which is the MKR asset. So that's like the governance and utility token of the MakerDAO. That sort of stands in contrast to the very stable and consumer-focused DAI stablecoin. Then there's like the extremely volatile and sort of expert and specialist-focused MKR token.
Okay.
And so what that token does is, first of all, it sets the rules that the system runs on. It sets the risk parameters of the system. So, for instance, MKR holders, they vote to decide, let's say, the liquidation ratio, right, of like when does a collateralized deposition become margin called, and they vote to set that specifically for ETH. So they set that, let's say, to 150% for ETH, and then they vote on it for gold, and that could be, let's say, 110% for gold because it's more stable, and it could be 105% for like treasury bonds or something. And so they just set all these rules for all the different assets in the collateral portfolio through like a rather intricate process that's like based around using the scientific method, basically. So like it's all about like open discussion and using like open source models and theories and like data-driven argumentation to sort of come to a scientific consensus on what is the optimal risk parameter for some particular asset given the current economic conditions.
Okay.
So first of all, so that's sort of first of all, we attempt to sort of align the risk of something backed by ETH with something backed by gold, because even if ETH is more risky than gold, then the risk parameters for ETH are just more strict, right? So like you need more ETH to generate DAI with than you need gold to do the same thing with.
Yep.
But even so, like that's still not enough, because it's not like you can guarantee that this scientific process is actually going to succeed, right? Like you could easily just end up like making mistakes, and obviously that'll happen all the time.
Sure.
And that's where this crucial feature of MKR comes into play, which is, we sort of see it as an attempt to actually solving the principal agent problem, right? Like, so it's like we're trying to like solve this issue of the people who manage money often are not the ones who actually face consequences when their management goes wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, things aren't quite like that in Maker. In fact, it's like when MKR holders, they don't set the risk parameters correctly, and there is like a crash that they didn't properly anticipate in some particular asset that they gave to, permissive risk parameters. Mm-hmm. And that could actually result in, like a total shortfall, like bad debt in the system, where there just isn't, like, even when the system tries to sell off the collateral to cover the debt, it ends up not being able to raise enough money. So like, if let's say if you have 300 debt, right, and your collateral now suddenly is worth $200, mm-hmm. right? Like then it doesn't matter how much the system tries to sell it; it's never gonna raise enough money. There's always going to be this shortfall of $100,
right?
And that's actually where MKR holders they just take the hit, basically. So what happens is the system just literally just prints MKR to raise sort of the final shortfall. So basically, it just like it does another auction where it basically says, I got $100 in bad debt. I need to raise $100. Who wants to pay me $100? Tell me how much MKR I have to print, so you'll pay me $100 worth of that. And then people will bid on this, right? And you will end up ultimately selling the MKR pretty much at the market rate, and just diluting the MKR total supply and harming MKR holders, right? Ultimately, so they pay the price because they like the proportional holdings of the total supply that they hold are now being diluted. And of course, that's not very nice, right? I mean, that's not very funny if you're an MKR holder.
I get that bit. The key bit I'm missing on this is, and what's the incentive to hold the MKR? That gives me the right to participate in this scientific governance scheme.
Yeah, I mean, so that's what I was about to get to, right?
Okay,
so of course, it's like one thing is they have to do all this work and set all these parameters, mm-hmm. and then they take the hit when the parameters aren't set well enough. But yeah, then like why even do it in the first place, right? And that's where the fees of the system come in. So there is actually a fee that is sort of a part of the risk parameters in the system, which is called the stability fee. And you can basically compare that to an interest rate or like a risk premium or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. It's like a value that's set on every single collateral type that sort of represents this inherent risk of being wrong, so to speak, for mm-hmm. that collateral type. And then it just so right now in the system, for instance, this stability fee is set at 0.5% for ETH. So people are basically paying an interest rate of 0.5%, which, however, is actually very, very low. And we expect it to be higher in the multi-collateral system.
So that would be 0.5% interest. Going back to my very earlier example, where I have my $1,000 of Ether turned into $1,300, that $300 extra is almost a loan that's charged at 0.5%.
Yeah, over the course of a year, yeah. And then the only way so the way sort of this fee ends up benefiting MKR holders is the only way you can pay this fee is by going to the market and purchasing MKR and then burning some amount of MKR that equals in value to the fee. So like, let's say the fee is 10 DAI. So you owe the system 10 DAI. You want to close your position. The only way you can close the position is if you purchase 10 DAI worth of MKR and then burn that MKR permanently, removing it from the supply.
And then you have the remaining supply, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then you have this counterbalance, right? Where when things are going well, the MKR supply is decreasing over time. So the supply is getting less and less, and there's these fees constantly coming into the, sort of the market cap or the market for MKR, just like driving up the price over time. And then when things are not going so well and the system has been mismanaged, or there's like a huge crash that wasn't properly anticipated, then the MKR supply is diluted, and the MKR holders take a hit for that, right? And they lose some money during these periods of time.
They say it's these scientific governors that either, if the system's working well, they make money. If it's not working well, they lose money.
Yeah, and it's really like the ultimate, like where, put your money where your mouth is, right? Like, so basically, if you're an MKR holder and you do your job really well, you will be handsomely rewarded, right? And it's going to be like a really lucrative asset to speculate in if you feel like you have a good, idea of where the markets are going, basically, right? But if you're wrong, then it's going to hurt you really badly because it's going to fall in price and it's going to be diluted. So it's like really we like to call it the highest risk, highest reward. Like there's very few assets that probably have a similar type of risk profile where it's just like when things are going well, they're going really well, and when things are going bad, they're going really, really bad.
Sure. And I would think logically that would attract the people with the greatest expertise and self-belief that they can actually solve these really hard problems of governing a system like this.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that just happens by itself. But I think it's also very likely that it's not necessarily going to be the case early on. But then what's really cool is that even if it doesn't naturally happen sort of initially with the initial, distribution of the coin, which, however, we have tried really hard to sort of safeguard and competently distribute the MKR token. For instance, we made it really hard to just buy in early on. So like people had to sort of Google stable coins and try really hard to actually find out about the project, right, and then be able to buy into it was always, it used to be a very difficult process where you had to use the decentralized exchange and just understand Ethereum really well. And so we sort of went viral in these very nerdy finance and economists and computer scientists, blockchain nerds circles, and it became sort of this insider thing where we have this initial group of just very knowledgeable domain specific people who actually do have to some degree have the competence to try to be able to govern this system. But even if this original stakeholder base doesn't do so well in the beginning, there is just this very nice sort of natural almost like survival of the fittest effect in the system, right? Where if the stakeholders are not controlling it very well, they get diluted, right? So actually their voting power is decreased whenever they make bad decisions, right? So then when there is this crash and there's a lot of MKR gets diluted, that means there are these new actors who get a chance to buy in and sort of provide some fresh blood and a new perspective on how it should be governed. And then if they then manage to turn things around and now govern set the system on a good path of stability where there isn't going to be more dilutive events in the future, their control gets consolidated, right? So then they get, the MKR supply actually decreases over time and their voting power increases. And so we expect that, assuming that the system doesn't die early on, if it manages to survive in the long term, it's just going to be this entirely new paradigm of stability, basically, right? Where it's just things will just be so massively consolidated and everything is focused on this singular goal of preventing the black swan event, right? Protecting and mitigating the impact of when things go really, really bad. And that is really, in the end, that's that's a service of a currency, right? A currency is the thing you trust no matter what, right? It's the thing you don't even think about it when you hold money or whatever. You just think, a dollar is a dollar, right? And
store of value, right?
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to achieve. Something similar, right? Where we have this system that just it has incentives and these processes in place that are, once they are mature enough, are basically infallible, right? Like they're not going to, like everything else will fail before this thing fails.
Right. Well, to
Is
me,
the
what sticks out is the system sits in stark contrast to the banking system, where if they have a 2008 style financial crisis and get bailed out, they don't bear the consequences of it and can continue business as usual. So it's rewarding bad behavior, if you know what I mean. Whereas this system doesn't have those kinds of preferential treatment. It's like it is survival of the fittest in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's really one of the core principles, right? That is like, I mean, we want it to be business as usual. I mean, so the point is that there is a huge crash. Well, for a DAI holder, that's business as usual. You don't have to worry about that.
Yep.
Like the system keeps functioning. But for the MKR holders, they take the massive hit, and they basically, they played with fire and they got burned, and that's kind of how it's supposed to be, right? And
right.
And then over time, they will just become more and more smart around how they run a system.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, in many ways, it's also very similar to the current financial system in how it sort of, it leverages all the established financial theories and models and knowledge that exists, but then just like, sort of boosts us a bit with like way more transparency and this, like the ability to verify anything at any point in time, right? I mean, you can always go on the blockchain and you can just audit it yourself, right? You can go at any time, you can see, okay, there's this much ETH, this much gold, this much bonds, and whatever, and everything can be sort of verified and traced and measured and model and all this stuff, and that really allows everyone to participate in the process of ultimately saying, okay, right now the system looks good, so you can count it as money, and you can use it in your business model and that kind of stuff.
Right.
At the same level as when a government does that, right? And you trust on government money, and in the long run, I mean, even beyond that, right? It's the hope that we can even go beyond where current government fiat money is able to go, where there is still this business cycle and financial crisis that require bailouts and so on.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the only point I was making about in your system. There's true accountability. Is all I was saying.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there is, and both in the sense that you lose money, and like the people who are responsible for not managing it correctly, they lose money. But then also in the sense that there's just like you don't have this option of like keeping stuff hidden or something, right? Like everything has to be on the books and in real time, right? And like anytime there's any sort of bad debt anywhere, it just immediately gets dealt with.
That's interesting. It's transparent by default. I like that. That's a very good point.
Yeah, and so what we're seeing is, when we're sort of pitching this and just like explaining this to businesses, they are, it's just like there's this crazy giant demand for this is what we're noticing, right? Like, and like it can revolutionize so many business models and like sectors, and in the short run, in particular, stuff like remittance is one that's really good. And then in particular, supply chain is like something that's very interesting, because in supply chain, you both really want to use the DAI stablecoin as like a currency and use it for your transactions, but also the credit market component of it, right? Like the collateralized debt positions actually are very interesting also, because they generate access to credit and in a more efficient way that currently exists.
Sure.
And actually, there are many places around the world and like in various industries where there just is very inefficient credit markets, usually because they're like super dominated by monolithic banks or something like that, right? And they're happy to give really good rates to like other big banks or like giant institutions or companies, but when it comes to like a small business, then they're like, well, yeah, I'll give you like a crazy high interest rate because I don't really care about you or something like that, right? And that's where we hope to come in and really disrupt by, ultimately the goal is to give everyone the same access, right? So like we wanted to make no difference if you're a bank or some small company. If you're coming with, let's say, some commodity as collateral, you're going to get the same terms for your loan, because ultimately you're using the same thing as collateral.
Absolutely.
And Yeah, and there's just like it's just staggering the amount of use cases there are, even in the short run. And really, the only thing we're waiting for at this point is like we're just getting ready to launch the full system this summer, and then just roll out aggressively.
Cool. Well, on that note, then, do you want to give out the links to where people can get involved in each of those tiers we spoke about? So, do you have just one main site that has everything on it?
Yeah. So the main site is makerdao.com.
Okay, and then from there, if someone wants to just use the DAI, they can learn about that. If they want to get involved at the maker level, they can do that. Or if they want to be like one of the market makers, they can find out about all that on their site.
Yes, I mean there's a white paper, there's like a description of the MKR token specifically. There's various links to exchanges and just other resources. And then in particular, I mean, what we really like is that we have this very strong community. So we like to point people towards our subreddit, which is reddit/r/makerdao, which is quite active nowadays. And then we also got like our own chat server. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like Slack, but it's open source called Rocket Chat. And that's on chat.makerdao.com.
All right, that sounds superb. Well, I'm much more well informed about this whole thing now, so I very much appreciate that. And that'll bring us to a close. So, Rune, thanks very much for being on the Cryptoverse today.
Thanks a lot for having me.